at the end of the day, first and foremost, accreditation standards exist to ensure educational quality and to prepare competent, capable graduates. And that core mission never changed. At the heart of these changes was a commitment to student success and well-being. And the council remains really clear on that, and that learning environments must be respectful, fair, and supportive for every student. And I think that we'll walk through all of that. If I had to sum up the changes in the language, I would say there are two main things that the language now points to. And one is unlawful discriminatory behavior, preventing unlawful discrimination. And the other one would be expanding opportunities or expanding access for all and maintaining the spirit of that.
Welcome to the On Air podcast. This podcast is a program of the American Association of Veterinary Medical Colleges Diversity Matters Initiative. The podcast explores various issues related to diversity and inclusion in the veterinary profession and provides the AAVMC an opportunity to offer ongoing programming to our member institutions and to all veterinary professionals. My name is Dr. Lisa Greenhill, and I am the Chief Organizational Health Officer here at the AAVMC. So on today's episode, we are discussing diversity and accreditation. Yay! I'd say somewhat sarcastically. So as many listeners know, in January of this year, the US president announced that this year would be an end to DEI. And since then, President Trump has released a number of executive orders. Departments across the federal government have produced dear colleagues and guidance documents on how institutions and organizations should move forward as we kind of are expected to strip issues in programming and efforts to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so many of you may remember that in January, there was the original executive order that sought to eliminate DEI programming and efforts that was really very, very broad. A dear colleague went out specifically from the Department of Education looking very, very specifically at particularly schools and institutions of higher education. And as a result, in March, the AAVMA Council on Education, like many other accreditors, announced an update to the existing standards for accreditation for colleges of veterinary medicine. And in that announcement, it stated that the COE would no longer require colleges to report on their DEI activities. Now, while a lot of folks like myself anticipated this announcement, it was really shocking and upsetting for a number of different, maybe smaller communities within the profession. And I should also say that there are lots of folks even in the profession that actually applaud this move. And there's certainly room for a lot of debate on this. Our accreditation is seen as an important arbiter of quality in higher education, not just in vet med, but it's also often misunderstood in its policies and practices and all of the processes that go into accreditation. It seems very mysterious and murky, and kind of folks don't know what's going on behind the veil, if you will. So in an effort to offer a bit of insider sunlight to this issue, I have invited friend of the pod, Dr. Samantha Morello, Associate Director for Education and Research at the AAVMA and staff member to the Council on Education, to explain the changes and what they mean for AAVMC member institutions. Hey, Sam, how are you?
Hey, Lisa, thanks for having me back on the pod. I'm doing well.
Great, great, great. So, as is our custom for folks that maybe don't know you, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So Lisa already gave me a bit of an introduction. My name is Sam Morello. I will tell you this is my third time on the pod. I am proud to say that. So I think when you do things 3 times, it becomes a hobby. So I guess this is my new hobby. My background is I'm a large animal surgeon. I spent the first almost 12 years of my career in academia. And I came to the AVMA almost 3 years ago as the associate director of education and research, working with the Council on Education. So I provide staff support to the COE. For those of you that don't know much about the COE, and if you're here on the AAVMC podcast, there are probably not too many of you who don't know what the COE is, but the COE is the programmatic accrediting body for veterinary medical colleges in the US and Canada, and also provides accreditation for international veterinary schools that request accreditation with the Council on Education. And so it provides oversight for quality assurance and promoting quality improvement for veterinary educational programs. And also that's what allows access to licensure in the US. The COE also has a link to some federal funding, which I'm not going to talk more about, but I think we're going to talk a little bit about in this podcast because it relates a little bit to why there is such tremendous impact when the government comes out with executive orders, guidance, guidelines, and talks about, what's going to happen when agencies don't comply with what those guidelines are. So anyway, that's a bit about me. I hope that I know a lot of you out there, and I hope that I can answer some of the questions that are still floating around.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for that brief overview, even on COE itself. So let's dig on in, because I know both of us and our other colleague, Dr. LaTanya Craig, your colleague at AVMA, have been fielding countless questions on this for a long time, almost 6 months now. So
it went fast.
Yes. Yeah, it goes fast, right? So, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of discussion on this issue, diversity and COE accreditation, and a lot of folks have said, "Hey, is this a relaxation of this language? Are we backing off? Like, oh my goodness, what's happening with respect to the expectations around DEI activities at the college, right? At the colleges, and whether or not the standards will still require, documentation of those activities and that type of thing." So, brass tacks, what has actually happened?
Well, I think the first thing that I want to help explain to shape this conversation is sort of where the COE does sit in terms of the government and in terms of programs, right? Because it's some of that relationship that matters to understand not just what happened, but why this all happened. So I talked briefly about COE accreditation as a requirement for licensure, which happens really at the state level. But one of the other things that accreditation with the COE provides a link for is some federal funding. So as an accreditor, and this is true of many programmatic accreditors, not all, but many programmatic accreditors, the Council on Education is recognized by the US Department of Education. And that really effectively does two things. One, it's a really rigorous recognition process. An accreditor that's recognized by the department has to meet a whole in-depth list of regulatory criteria. Those regulatory criteria are set out by law. And it's really like, schools need to meet accreditation standards, and accreditors also need to meet standards. That's what those regulatory criteria are. So somebody's regulating us too. So it's a quality assurance mechanism for accreditors. And the COE is, regulated essentially by the Department of Education, as well as another group called the Council for Higher Education Accreditation. So that's one thing that does. It gives the COE kind of a seal of approval from the Department of Education. What it also does is it gives the COE a link to, or it gives programs who are accredited by the COE a link to federal funding. And it's a specific type of federal funding. It's not the student loans, what we call Title IV student loans, which are the general student loans that if there are any students out there, that most of you guys are getting to fund your education. But these are called health profession student loans. So these are Title VII loans that actually come from Health and Human Services, and these are lower interest loans. So they're usually at about a 5% rate, and they're for qualifying students. So usually students who are in need, and they're administered through the school. So the school needs to be able to qualify for these loans to give students access. So they're really, for students who do qualify and for schools that have access to them, these are really valuable loans. And they actually currently do not count towards the loan caps that are being administered through the Department of Education. So these are separate loans than what we've been talking a lot about when we're talking about the federal loan caps that just got put in place.
Right.
So it's because of COE accreditation and recognition through the Department of Education that students have access to these loans. And through a really sort of general census of how many students are getting these loans, how much money is wrapped up in these loans right now, we think that somewhere around 1,000 students across the country are accessing these loans, and somewhere in the realm of about $12 million a year are coming through schools through these health profession student loans. And that's, right, Lisa, that's a significant amount. That's a lot of loan money that students are accessing, particularly at a low interest rate. So that's a really long-winded way of saying that the COE's relationship to the Department of Education and to the federal government is important. It benefits schools and it benefits students. Right. So that being said, when this guidance came out in January. There was a Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Education in February. And right after that happened, the first thing the council did was not change but pause implementation of certain aspects of the standards to kind of see what was going on in the environment and take an accounting of what was going to happen and what the risk was to programs, first and foremost, programs and students, and then ultimately what role the council was going to need to play in protecting students and protecting programs and protecting the money that was necessary with these loans, right? So as you already described, there was continued messaging from the government about, what their goals were for organizations that were receiving federal funding and how they needed to follow the guidelines. And not even a month ago, at the end of July, the Department of Justice came forward and said how they were going to implement some of their plans for following guidance on DEI. And so using all that, back in, I think it was May, the council put out some proposed new language to its standards. And that language did remove the words diversity, equity, inclusion, several other words that were in that vein to align them more, would not put the COE's programs and the students that receive education at these programs and funding from the federal government at risk. But I really want to be clear that at the end of the day, first and foremost, accreditation standards exist to ensure educational quality and to prepare competent, capable graduates. And that core mission never changed. At the heart of these changes was a commitment to student success and well-being. And the council remains really clear on that, and that learning environments must be respectful, fair, and supportive for every student. And I think that we'll walk through all of that. So when the council proposed changes to the language, removing specific DEI terminology really never meant backing away from things like fairness, support, access. It really meant a doubling down on the principle that all students deserve respect, support, equal opportunity, and wanted to make sure that would happen without ambiguity or uneven enforcement. And that uneven enforcement topic is really key. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that maybe in a minute or two here.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for all of that. So I mean, and I think that this is such an important topic. And I mean, I've been involved in it for a really long time, having drafted some of the original DEI language that actually appears in the standards and seeing it evolve over time. And so, but like I said, in the context of the current environment, none of this was surprising. And in fact, even though, AAVMC is not a recipient of federal funding, and we're not, accredited by anyone as an organization in any of those things, we didn't meet any of those criteria. Again, recognizing that our schools may not be able to access some of our programming that includes content on diversity, we had to make some changes in order to maintain, member access to programming, and just kind of really understanding the position, the sometimes challenging position that some of our institutions were experiencing, which leads me to this next piece that, the language that appears like in the PMP, what is PMP? PMP is the
Policy and
Policies
procedures.
and Procedures Manual. I've been calling it PMP for like 20 years. I'm like, what does it stand for again? And the standards included phrasing that was like, consistent with applicable law. Well,
Right.
the reality was we had about 16 institutions that were prohibited from reporting on things because of state law. Like we've been
Right.
seeing this, state actions against diversity in particularly in education and higher education. So there was already, this kind of some folks are mandated to report because they don't have restrictions in their state, and then some were. And at 16, we're almost half, not quite half, but
Right.
getting pretty close to half of our institutions were unable to report on things. That doesn't mean that they aren't able to do things, but in some states they can't. But
Right.
it does mean that they were unable to report on things. And so, at the time, I remember when that language came to be, I remember feeling some kind of way, but there was a lot of foresight. But, with that caveat of consistent with applicable law, why was it still necessary to change the language? I mean, you've kind of already answered that, but
I think we both already answered it. So, yeah, I mean, even irrespective of what was happening at the federal level, we were already seeing these changes at the state level. And so I think there are about 28 states now that have either passed or enforced legislation that prohibits DEI in some capacity at state
yeah,
funded institutions. And so we already had schools that couldn't write to the standards as they were written because the standards specifically included DEI language, right? And so there was no way for schools to report on what they were doing with respect to the standards as they were written. And there was no way for the council to understand what the environments were for students and for the council to implement standards, to implement compliance assessment, right? And so revising the language at that point was a way to create clear, consistent, and enforceable expectations across all jurisdictions. So consistent with applicable law didn't allow the council to change the standards or the language in the standards every time they went to a different program that had different state laws, as the language was not flexible enough or broad enough to allow enforceability in those different jurisdictions. And so there were really sort of two things going on simultaneously, which you just brought up. One that was happening at the federal level and one thing that was happening at the state level. And so really, this was a moment that allowed the council to expand the way that the standards would create expectations for enforcing standards that would allow for oversight of respectful, fair, supportive environments for students in places where the standards were no longer able to do that.
Yeah.
So in a way, it actually improved the accreditor's ability to do that where it had already been lost in some ways.
Yeah. So what does the language say now?
There are two main, we changed the language in several different standards. The council approved changes in the language in standard 1, organization, as just a word in standard 4, clinical resources, in standard 6, about students, in standard 7, admissions, in standard 8, faculty, in standard 9, curriculum, and in standard 11, outcomes assessment. And I list those because I think it's important to note just how how woven throughout the standards the idea of protecting students, ensuring accessibility, and the intent and values were, because it is so important. And so it's not that language was, there are some accreditors who simply removed all language without revising language. And what the council really did was take a thoughtful approach to looking at the language that was there and thinking about, how do we maintain the values that the council believes in, that the profession believes in, and that are the goals for not just students, but for the profession at large, right? Because students become the profession once they graduate. And so if I had to sum up the changes in the language, I would say that there are two main things that the language now points to. And one is unlawful discriminatory behavior, preventing unlawful discrimination. And the other one would be expanding opportunities or expanding access for all, and maintaining the spirit of that, so that it ensures that it's not for a specific group or in a specific instance, but ensuring that access is in all circumstances available to all and in all areas, right? And that's inclusive of all people, backgrounds, viewpoints, beliefs, cultures, etc. So
Sure.
it's very much in line, again, with the ideology that I think has always been there and was always the intent, and it's being emphasized in a broad way, and with different words, but with the same objective values of making sure that all people, have the ability to be part of this profession and are given that chance.
Great. Yeah, and I think that the other kind of challenge for some folks that don't understand accreditation was kind of the reporting piece, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I was at a meeting this spring, and I was at a meeting in June when this was very hot topic. It's been a hot topic for several months now, but it was a very hot topic. And it dawned on me that the word reporting is what kind of also was tripping people up and actually triggering a conflation between reporting to the COE versus reporting out data about the colleges, right? And that's when I kind of had my own light bulb moment. I was like, oh, because unless a college publishes, there are some institutions that may put their self-study or interim reports on their website, but not all of them do. And, that's an institutional choice. But I also don't know a whole bunch of people that are going and downloading those documents
for weekend reading material. No.
Like, it's great nighttime reading.
The summer hit. It's
I mean, insomniacs unite, right? Great to kind of read this. And I was like, oh, I think that folks seem to think that maybe in that reporting, not only is an institution potentially being assessed, but that's where a lot of the data is sourced. And I'm like, actually, no, they report. We do surveys at AAVMC, and that data about kind of what the landscape of an institution looks like demographically is published on our website. And I think that there was also kind of a bit of a conflation of, oh my goodness, will we not have this data anymore? And I'm like, no, we'll still have this data, at least until those requirements change. And again, it's not AAVMC that would be changing the requirements. It would really be the administration saying, we're not going to collect these demographic markers anymore, which does not seem to be the direction that they're moving in.
No, and it's still legal for programs to collect that data. An accreditor wouldn't necessarily collect it, and the COE is not collecting it because there's not a reason to collect that data if it's not going to be used in an accreditation, in a decision of compliance or in an understanding of compliance. And because it would not be lawful to consider that demographic data in understanding the college's compliance, it's no longer going to be used in accreditation reporting, right? So you explained the difference between the institutional data report or the public
Right.
data that you put out and accreditation, they're two very separate things. So it's still valuable for institutions to use. It's valuable for you to be able to put out, but it's not going to be something that the council uses as much as people might like to know and understand that. And it's data to be celebrated, of course, for various reasons, but it's not going to be used in understanding compliance.
Right. So, what else do you want folks to know about this issue and accreditation? What are any other big things?
I think one thing, because the AAVMC is, it's an international organization, and the COE does accredit international programs. And the landscape of things is diverging more and more, perhaps, between what programs may need to do here in the United States versus what they may need to do in some of the programs internationally that we work with. Yeah. Right. And so the standards are the standards, but the updated standards still allow schools flexibility to use the approaches and the terminology that best fit their own mission and their own framework. So they're not meant to be limiting. And schools have that autonomy to speak to what it is that they do and celebrate what it is that they do. And so in no way are changes to the standards meant to limit schools in locations where they may have
where things are different.
Where things are different. Yeah, where programming is different, where the expectations are different. And that too will be understood and considered for compliance. So I think that's important. And the other thing that I think is important for people to know. I mean, this is true of the process that the council went through for updating these standards, and it's true for the process that the council goes through anytime they consider a change to the standards. The council took the step after considering what's going on in the environment, considering what was necessary to protect programs and students, but also after listening to what was many voices. Many people submitted their feedback to the council, and I can tell you that every single one of those voices was heard. Every single piece of feedback that was submitted was read and considered, as it always is in these situations. And so that was collected from deans, from faculty, from students, from veterinary professionals. And that's a process that's consistent every time the standards are changed. And this was just another example of that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for also acknowledging that things may look different for our international colleagues, right? And so certainly we've had a lot of discussions internally at AAVMC about this, and our international members largely are like, yeah, a lot of them still fully intend to report. This is a major issue and commitment for them. And again, sometimes the language is very different. A lot of times we say in the US, DEI, a lot of other places will have EDI. I mean, the letters just kind of move around, but things in other countries may look really different, and that results in the institutions in those countries reporting potentially in very different ways than the American institutions, which is already also happening because they're international institutions, right? I mean, some of them are 5-year programs. There's programs that, all of these programs, there's a lot of diversity within the AAVMC membership. And so the language flexibility is actually greatly appreciated.
Yes, as it should be. I mean, there have always been some cultural differences across the globe as the council goes and accredits schools internationally, and that's always looked different, as it should be, and that's always acknowledged, and that continues to be the case, and that will just look different in some of how things are reported going forward as well. And that's, again, acknowledged and celebrated, that there are some of these differences when we have the opportunity to see what people are doing all over the world. But we view that as a good thing.
Great. And so as we end, I just want to say, that AAVMC certainly remains committed to these issues and providing programming to our members. We deeply believe in these things because of the outcomes, right? Like, we recognize that this is a part of the educational process, and we want folks from all over, every corner. We want clients to feel like they are seen and heard, and we want animal health outcomes that are highly desired, right? We want those types of things, and we recognize that those are outputs of a good educational program, right? Where we're actually able to meet people where they are, and diverse graduates is a part of that, right? And so it's one part of that larger discussion. So Sam, I'm so glad that you're able to kind of come on the show and talk a little bit about that, and share and provide some sunlight to this issue, because I do think that there's still a lot of chatter. We were both at AVMA convention here in DC literally a month ago. It feels like
a year.
Yeah, it feels like I was going to say two. It feels like 2 years, like 1 year for each 2 week period. And certainly myself, Dr. Craig, Dr. Wiseman, we had an opportunity to chat with the staff of my House of Delegates and really kind of get into this a bit more, which certainly I think helped bring some greater understanding. But we also recognize that there were a lot of folks that weren't in that room for that particular discussion. And so thank you so much for coming on the show and really giving us a broader overview, one, of accreditation, and two, what the COE is doing to ensure that students are protected and able to still access additional funds, which we may have to do a show on financial aid, not with you, but because that's a whole other can of wax that we're trying to still sift through. And so thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lisa, for creating the space. This was great, and hopefully clarified some things to some people, but we're always here to answer those questions when anybody has them to ask.
So where can they find you to send those?
Well, the COE's got a website. The easiest thing to do is just Google AVMA COE, and it'll send you right our way instead of you having to memorize a website. And on those websites, it'll have the AVMA COE email that you can send questions to. And we are very good at responding.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. So this has been another episode of AAVMC's On Air podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and we will be back soon with another episode. We've got some great stuff coming this fall, so stay tuned. Thank you.